What if I told you that the technology that finally caught the Golden State Killer could solve the JonBenét Ramsey case tomorrow, but the police refuse to use it? Picture this. You're a father who has spent 28 years fighting for justice for your murdered 6-year-old daughter. You've endured public accusations, media vilification, and conspiracy theories that painted you as the killer. Then, in 2025, you discover that crucial evidence from your daughter's crime scene was never properly tested. Evidence that could identify her real killer using the same technology that cracked dozens of cold cases across America. Have you ever felt like someone in power was deliberately hiding the truth from you? Have you experienced the frustration of watching bureaucracy stand between you and something you desperately need? Do you know what it's like when the very people supposed to help you seem more interested in protecting themselves than finding answers? That's exactly what John Ramsey is living through right now, nearly 3 decades after his daughter JonBenét was found murdered in their Boulder, Colorado home on December 26. And what he's discovered in recent months should outrage every single person who believes in justice. If you've ever wondered why some cases stay cold when they shouldn't, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn will change how you view law enforcement forever. The problem isn't lack of evidence, it isn't lack of technology, it's something far more disturbing: institutional resistance to admitting mistakes and pursuing truth when it doesn't fit the narrative they've spent decades defending. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what's happening behind closed doors in Boulder, Colorado, and why 2025 might be the year everything changes. You'll discover why a grieving father is fighting his own police department, why cutting-edge DNA technology sits unused, and how a Netflix documentary has forced law enforcement to confront uncomfortable truths they've hidden for years. This isn't just another true crime story. This is a masterclass in how justice can be delayed, denied, and manipulated, and how one man's refusal to give up might finally expose the truth. For 28 years, John Ramsey believed that everything that could be done had been done. He trusted that every piece of evidence from his daughter's murder scene had been thoroughly analyzed, that every lead had been pursued, that the Boulder Police Department was doing everything in their power to find JonBenét's killer. He was wrong. In early 2025, John Ramsey sat down for what he hoped would be a breakthrough meeting with Boulder's new police chief. Armed with renewed hope and the backing of a Netflix documentary that had reignited global interest in his daughter's case, he walked into that meeting with a simple request: use genetic genealogy testing on the unknown male DNA found at the crime scene. Genetic genealogy, the same revolutionary technology that identified the Golden State Killer after 40 years, that solved the Bear Brook murders, that has cracked over 500 cold cases since 2018. This isn't experimental science. This is proven, reliable, game-changing technology that has given families across America the answers they've waited decades to receive. But what John discovered in that meeting shattered everything he thought he knew about his daughter's investigation. The garrote used to strangle JonBenét, a crude device made from a paintbrush, handle, and cord that the killer constructed inside the Ramsey home, had been returned to the family years earlier. Returned without being fully tested for DNA. Think about that for a moment. The murder weapon, crafted by the killer's own hands, potentially containing their skin cells, their touch DNA, their genetic fingerprint, sitting in evidence storage, then handed back to the family like a piece of personal property. Not all evidence was tested in the original investigation. John Ramsey revealed to CNN, his voice carrying the weight of nearly 3 decades of frustration. Some items, including that garrote, were never subjected to the advanced DNA analysis that could identify his daughter's killer. For a father who has endured 28 years of suspicion, accusation, and conspiracy theories, this revelation was devastating. How many nights had he wondered if the killer was someone he knew, someone in his community, someone walking free while his family lived under a cloud of suspicion? How many times had he been told that everything possible was being done, that the investigation was thorough, that they just needed to wait for science to advance? The science had advanced. It had advanced years ago, but it wasn't being used. When John pressed the new police chief about genetic genealogy testing, he received what can only be described as bureaucratic double talk. Despite the Boulder Police Department's public statements that they are pursuing all viable leads, including DNA testing, John left that meeting with the same answer he's received for years: promises without action, deflection without commitment. The first life lesson here is crystal clear. Never assume that those in authority are doing everything they can, even when they tell you they are. John Ramsey's mistake wasn't trusting the police initially, it was continuing to trust them when their actions didn't match their words. But John's discovery went deeper than untested evidence. Through his own investigation and the research conducted for the Netflix documentary, he learned that crucial DNA evidence that could have cleared his family had been kept secret for months, possibly years, evidence that contradicted the very foundation of the police department's investigation, their theory that someone in the Ramsey family was responsible for JonBenét's death. This wasn't just investigative incompetence, this was deliberate withholding of exonerating evidence while a family endured public crucifixion. While John, his late wife Patsy, and their son Burke were subjected to interrogations, media speculation, and worldwide accusations of child murder, the police had DNA evidence that pointed to an unknown male perpetrator, evidence they chose not to reveal. The emotional weight of this discovery is impossible to overstate. Imagine learning that your child's real killer might have been identified years ago, if only the people investigating her death had been willing to follow the evidence instead of protecting their theory. Imagine discovering that while you suffered through decades of accusation and suspicion, the truth was sitting in a police file, gathering dust. This is what drives John Ramsey's relentless advocacy today. It's not just about finding his daughter's killer anymore. It's about exposing a system that has failed so spectacularly that it borders on criminal negligence. It's about ensuring that no other family endures what his family has endured, because investigators were more interested in being right than being thorough. But here's what makes John Ramsey's story truly remarkable. Instead of becoming bitter, instead of giving up, instead of accepting that justice would never come, he chose to fight harder. At 81 years old, with every reason to fade into privacy, he's mounting the most aggressive campaign for justice that this case has ever seen. The second life lesson is equally powerful. When institutions fail you, you don't have to accept that failure as final. Sometimes justice requires citizen advocacy, not just faith in the system. In November 2024, Netflix released Cold Case: Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey? The documentary didn't just retell a familiar story, it exposed a cover-up that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. The bombshell revelation was stunning in its simplicity. DNA evidence that excluded the Ramsey family as suspects had been deliberately kept secret by Boulder police for months, possibly years, because it contradicted their preferred theory of family involvement. Let me break this down for you, because the implications are staggering. In 1997, just months after JonBenét's murder, DNA testing revealed the presence of an unknown male's genetic material on the child's clothing and fingernails. This wasn't trace contamination. This wasn't secondary transfer. This was substantial enough to create a Codus profile, the kind of DNA evidence that can definitively identify a perpetrator. The presence of this unknown male DNA should have immediately shifted the investigation's focus from the family to identifying this unknown perpetrator. Instead, Boulder police kept these results largely secret while continuing to pursue the Ramsey family as their primary suspects. Think about the timeline here. While John and Patsy Ramsey were being subjected to hours of interrogation, while they were being publicly vilified in the media, while conspiracy theories about their guilt spread around the world, the police had scientific evidence that pointed to an unknown male killer, evidence they chose not to emphasize publicly. Why would they do this? The Netflix documentary reveals what many legal experts had suspected for years: institutional bias and investigative tunnel vision. The Boulder Police Department had committed so heavily to the theory of family involvement that they couldn't admit they were wrong, even when the science contradicted their assumptions. This kind of confirmation bias isn't unique to the Ramsey case, but the scale and consequences here are extraordinary. How many other families have been destroyed by investigative tunnel vision? How many cases remain unsolved because investigators refuse to follow evidence that contradicts their preconceptions? The documentary also revealed disturbing details about crime scene contamination that occurred in the crucial first hours after JonBenét disappeared. Family friends were allowed to search the house. Potential evidence was disturbed. The scene was compromised in ways that would be unthinkable in a modern investigation. But here's the most damning revelation. When John Ramsey discovered his daughter's body in the basement and carried her upstairs, he was following police instructions. Detective Linda Arndt had asked him to search the house. The subsequent contamination of evidence, wasn't the result of a guilty father disturbing a crime scene. It was the result of police asking a desperate father to help find his missing child. The impact of the Netflix documentary was immediate and profound. Tips began flooding into Boulder police. Media figures who had spent years perpetuating conspiracy theories about the family's guilt began issuing public apologies. Geraldo Rivera, who had been particularly vocal in suggesting Ramsey family involvement, publicly apologized to John Ramsey for his role in the family's vilification. "I owe you an apology," Rivera said during a live television appearance. "I was wrong about you and your family, and I'm sorry for the pain my speculation caused. But apologies, while meaningful, don't solve murders." What the documentary really accomplished was creating unprecedented public pressure for law enforcement to finally pursue every available avenue for identifying JonBenét's killer. Share this video if you think families deserve transparency from law enforcement. Because what happened to the Ramseys represents everything wrong with how some police departments handle high-profile cases. The third life lesson here is crucial. When institutions make mistakes, they're often more invested in covering them up than correcting them. The Boulder Police Department's resistance to admitting their errors has cost precious time and potentially allowed a killer to remain free for nearly 3 decades. The DNA evidence was there all along. The technology to analyze it has existed for years. The only thing standing between the Ramsey family and justice is institutional pride and bureaucratic stubbornness. But the Netflix documentary did something else. It reminded the world that JonBenét Ramsey wasn't just a tabloid sensation or a conspiracy theory. She was a 6-year-old child who was brutally murdered in her own home, and her killer has never been held accountable. The documentary's most powerful moments weren't the dramatic recreations or the expert analysis. They were the quiet scenes of John Ramsey, now 81, still fighting for his daughter, still believing that justice is possible, still refusing to let her case become just another cold file in a police archive. His persistence in the face of institutional resistance is a masterclass in never giving up, even when the odds seem impossible. Even when the very people who should be helping you seem more interested in protecting themselves. While Boulder police were focusing on the Ramsey family, veteran homicide detective Lou Smith was quietly building what may be the most comprehensive suspect database in American criminal history. Smith, who was brought in specifically to assist with the JonBenét investigation, compiled a spreadsheet containing approximately 600 potential suspects, names, backgrounds, connections, and investigative notes that represented years of meticulous police work. Lou Smith wasn't just any detective. He was a legendary investigator who had solved more than 200 homicide cases during his career. When he first examined the JonBenét Ramsey evidence, he reached a conclusion that put him at odds with his own department. This was the work of an intruder, not a family member. The evidence that convinced Smith included the unusual construction of the garage, the presence of unknown DNA, unexplained footprints in the basement, and signs of forced entry that other investigators had dismissed. But Smith didn't just theorize about an intruder. He systematically began building a list of everyone who could have committed this crime. For years, that list remained Lou Smith's private investigation. Names of suspects ranged from strangers who had interacted with the family to individuals with histories of child abuse, from people with connections to Boulder to those who might have targeted the Ramseys specifically. Each entry represented hours of investigation, background checks, and analysis. When Lou Smith died in 2010, he passed his life's work on to his daughter, Cindy Mara. For more than a decade, she has continued her father's investigation, systematically working through that list of 600 suspects, collecting DNA samples and methodically ruling out individuals one by one. The results of Cindy Mara's work are both encouraging and frustrating. She and her team have successfully ruled out approximately 25 individuals through DNA testing, proof that genetic analysis can definitively eliminate suspects. But none of the 25 tested so far have matched the unknown male DNA found at the JonBenét crime scene. Think about what this means. There's a list of 600 potential suspects. Advanced DNA technology exists that could identify the killer if their genetic material is in that database. Independent investigators are willing to do the work, and yet progress is limited because they don't have the resources or authority to test every name on that list. This is where the story becomes both inspiring and infuriating. Cindy Mara represents everything that's right about the pursuit of justice. Dedication, methodical investigation, refusal to give up. But she's working with limited resources while the agency with unlimited resources, the Boulder Police Department, continues to resist the very technology that could solve this case. The existence of Lou Smith's suspect list also raises uncomfortable questions about the original investigation. If a single detective could identify 600 potential suspects, why didn't the entire Boulder Police Department pursue similar comprehensive investigations? Why was the focus so narrowly concentrated on the family when clearly there were hundreds of other possibilities? The answer, according to multiple law enforcement experts, is tunnel vision combined with inexperience. Boulder is not a high-crime city. The investigators assigned to this case had never handled a child murder of this magnitude. They made assumptions early in the investigation, and then spent years trying to prove those assumptions rather than following the evidence wherever it led. Lou Smith's approach was the opposite. He let the evidence guide his investigation rather than trying to make the evidence fit his theory. That's why his suspect list is so comprehensive. He wasn't looking for confirmation of a predetermined conclusion. He was looking for the truth, wherever it might lead. The fourth life lesson here is profound: how dedicated individuals can accomplish what institutions cannot. Lou Smith, working largely on his own, created a more comprehensive investigation than an entire police department. His daughter, working with volunteers and limited resources, has made more progress testing suspects than law enforcement agencies with million-dollar budgets. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Somewhere in that list of 600 names might be JonBenét Ramsey's killer. The person who strangled a 6-year-old child in her own home on Christmas night might already be identified, catalogued, and waiting for DNA testing that could bring him to justice. Every day that genetic genealogy testing is delayed is another day that killer remains free. Another day that John Ramsey waits for justice. Another day that Lou Smith's meticulous work sits unused while the most advanced forensic technology in human history remains off limits. The irony is staggering. We live in an era where genetic genealogy can identify suspects from DNA evidence decades old, where familial matching can trace genetic connections through multiple generations, where cold cases from the 1970s are being solved through technology that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years ago. But in Boulder, Colorado, that technology sits unused while a 600-person suspect list waits for proper investigation. Not because the technology doesn't work, it's already solved hundreds of cold cases. Not because the evidence doesn't exist. Unknown male DNA from the crime scene is available for testing. But because institutional resistance and bureaucratic inertia continue to block the path to justice. This is bigger than just the JonBenét Ramsey case. This is about how we as a society demand accountability from the institutions we trust to protect us and pursue justice on our behalf. Genetic genealogy isn't just an incremental improvement in forensic science, it's a revolutionary technology that has fundamentally changed what's possible in criminal investigation. To understand why this technology is perfect for the JonBenét Ramsey case, you need to understand exactly how it works and why it's so powerful. Traditional DNA analysis requires a direct match. Your DNA profile has to match something already in the CODIS database, the FBI's national DNA database, containing profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes. If your DNA isn't in that system, traditional analysis hits a dead end. Genetic genealogy changes everything. Instead of requiring a direct match, it uses the same technology as consumer DNA services like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA to identify relatives of the unknown suspect. Even if the killer's DNA isn't in any criminal database, his relatives might have submitted their DNA to genealogy websites, creating a genetic pathway that leads directly to him. The process is methodical and precise. Forensic genealogists upload the unknown DNA profile to public genetic databases and identify anyone who shares significant genetic markers. Then they build family trees, working backward and forward through generations, until they identify individuals who could be the source of the original DNA sample. This isn't guesswork. This is hard science backed by mathematical certainty. When genetic genealogy identifies a suspect, that identification can be confirmed through direct DNA comparison with absolute precision. The Golden State Killer case demonstrates the power of this technology. For 40 years, Joseph James DeAngelo terrorized California, committing at least 13 murders and dozens of rapes. Traditional DNA analysis had identified his genetic profile, but couldn't name him because he wasn't in any criminal database. In 2018, genetic genealogy changed everything. Investigators uploaded his DNA profile to a public database and identified distant relatives. Working through family trees, they narrowed their search to Joseph James DeAngelo. A direct DNA comparison confirmed the match, and one of America's most prolific serial killers was finally brought to justice. Since then, genetic genealogy has solved over 500 cold cases. The Bear Brook murders in New Hampshire, 4 victims killed in the 1980s and dumped in barrels, remained unsolved for decades, until genetic genealogy identified both the killer and the victims. The Buckskin Girl case in Ohio, cold for 37 years, was solved in a matter of months once genetic genealogy was applied. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Grim Sleeper, cases that seemed hopeless became solvable once this technology was properly utilized. Families who had waited decades for answers finally received justice. But here's what makes genetic genealogy particularly powerful for the JonBenét Ramsey case. The killer left substantial DNA evidence at the crime scene. Unlike many cold cases where DNA evidence is minimal or degraded, the JonBenét case has a strong genetic profile that would be ideal for genealogical analysis. The unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing and under her fingernails isn't trace evidence that might have innocent explanations. This is substantial genetic material that clearly indicates direct contact with the victim. It's exactly the kind of evidence that genetic genealogy is designed to analyze. Moreover, the JonBenét case has something many cold cases lack: massive public attention and extensive documentation. If genetic genealogy identifies a suspect, there's already a comprehensive investigative foundation to build upon. Lou Smith's 600-person suspect list could be cross-referenced with genetic findings. Witness statements, alibis, and timelines from the original investigation could be re-examined. The technology exists. The evidence exists. The investigative foundation exists. The only thing missing is the will to use these tools. Comment below. Should police be required to use every available technology in murder cases? Because the families of murder victims deserve to know that everything possible is being done to find their loved ones' killers. Other families across America have discovered what's possible when genetic genealogy is properly applied. The daughter of a murder victim in Texas waited 30 years for answers before genetic genealogy identified her mother's killer. The sister of a rape victim in California fought for decades before this technology finally brought her sibling's attacker to justice. These families share something in common with John Ramsey. They never gave up. They kept fighting, kept advocating, kept demanding that law enforcement use every available tool, and eventually, their persistence paid off. The fifth life lesson is about the power of technological advancement to overcome human limitations. Technology can overcome human bias, institutional inertia, and investigative mistakes. Genetic genealogy doesn't care about theories or assumptions or departmental politics. It follows genetic evidence to its logical conclusion, regardless of who that conclusion might embarrass. But technology is only as effective as our willingness to use it. The most advanced forensic science in the world is useless if it sits on a shelf while bureaucrats debate and delay. This is why John Ramsey's fight matters beyond just his own family's quest for justice. Every day that genetic genealogy remains unused in high-profile cases like this is a day that other families lose hope. Every delay sends a message that some lives matter less than others, that some cases are worth solving while others aren't. The JonBenét Ramsey case could be solved tomorrow if Boulder police would simply submit the unknown male DNA to genetic genealogy analysis. Not might be solved, not possibly solved. Could be solved with the same technology that has already brought justice to hundreds of other families. The question isn't whether this technology will eventually identify JonBenét's killer. The question is how much longer bureaucratic resistance will delay justice for a family that has already waited 28 years. The Boulder Police Department's response to mounting pressure for genetic genealogy testing reveals everything wrong with how some law enforcement agencies handle criticism and accountability. Instead of embracing technology that could finally solve their most notorious case, they've chosen deflection, denial, and bureaucratic stonewalling. In November 2024, faced with renewed public scrutiny following the Netflix documentary, Boulder Police issued a statement that was remarkable for its tone deafness. The assertion that there is viable evidence and leads we are not pursuing, to include DNA testing, is completely false. Read that statement again. They're not just defending their investigation, they're categorically denying that there's any evidence they haven't pursued. This despite John Ramsey's specific claims about untested items, including the gyro that was returned to the family without complete DNA analysis. Either John Ramsey is lying about evidence that wasn't tested, or Boulder Police are being deliberately misleading about the scope of their investigation. Given that John Ramsey has nothing to gain by making false claims, and everything to lose if his statements are proven incorrect, their categorical denial raises serious questions about transparency and honesty. Chief Maris Herrell did acknowledge that there were a number of things that people have pointed to throughout the years that could have been done better, but this carefully worded admission reveals the problem. They're acknowledging mistakes in the abstract, while denying specific criticisms about current failures. This is classic institutional behavior when facing accountability. Admit to vague past errors while refusing to address specific current shortcomings. Promise to do better while continuing the same practices that created the problems in the first place. The politics of admitting investigative failures runs deeper than most people realize. For Boulder Police to fully embrace genetic genealogy and acknowledge that crucial evidence wasn't properly tested would require admitting that their investigation was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Think about the implications. If genetic genealogy identifies JonBenét's killer tomorrow, that would prove that the technology could have identified him years ago if it had been properly utilized. It would prove that the Ramsey family endured decades of suspicion unnecessarily. It would prove that every delay in using this technology was a delay in justice. For a police department that has spent nearly 3 decades defending their investigation, that level of public accountability would be devastating. It's easier to maintain that everything possible was done than to admit that the most important case in the department's history was botched from the beginning. But institutional resistance goes beyond just protecting reputations. There's a deeper problem. Some law enforcement agencies view outside pressure and criticism as attacks on their authority rather than opportunities to improve their effectiveness. When John Ramsey advocates for genetic genealogy testing, some officials see this as a criticism of their competence rather than a suggestion for solving the case. When independent investigators like Cindy Murrah make progress testing suspects, some officials view this as embarrassing rather than helpful. This defensive mindset creates a perverse incentive structure where protecting the institution becomes more important than pursuing justice, where being seen as wrong becomes worse than allowing a killer to remain free. The Boulder Police Department's handling of this case represents everything wrong with how some agencies respond to accountability pressure. Instead of embracing help, they resist it. Instead of acknowledging limitations, they deny them. Instead of using every available tool, they make excuses for why those tools aren't necessary. Consider the multidisciplinary team that law enforcement sources claim is reviewing all remaining evidence and applying the latest cold case techniques. This sounds impressive until you realize that genetic genealogy, the most important advancement in cold case investigation in the past 50 years, apparently isn't part of their latest techniques. The FBI's continued involvement is often cited as evidence that everything possible is being done. But FBI involvement doesn't guarantee that genetic genealogy is being used. Federal agencies are just as capable of bureaucratic resistance and institutional pride as local departments. The sixth life lesson here is crucial. Sometimes justice requires citizen advocacy, not just faith in institutions. When those institutions fail to act, public pressure becomes the only mechanism for accountability. John Ramsey's public campaign for genetic genealogy testing isn't just about his daughter's case. It's about establishing the principle that families have a right to demand that law enforcement use every available tool to solve murders. It's about creating precedent that bureaucratic convenience doesn't trump justice. But there's also a darker lesson here about how institutions protect themselves at the expense of their stated mission. The Boulder Police Department's primary responsibility is solving crimes and bringing killers to justice. But their behavior suggests that protecting their reputation and avoiding embarrassment has become more important than fulfilling that responsibility. This isn't unique to Boulder. Police departments across America struggle with accountability, transparency, and admitting mistakes. The difference is that most departments don't have a case as high profile as JonBenét Ramsey where their failures are so publicly visible. The resistance to genetic genealogy in this case sends a chilling message to other families seeking justice. Even when technology exists that could solve your loved one's murder, bureaucratic resistance might prevent it from being used. Even when independent investigators are willing to help, institutional pride might block their assistance. This is why John Ramsey's fight matters beyond his own family's quest for justice. He's fighting for the principle that murder investigations should use every available tool, regardless of how that might embarrass the investigators. He's fighting for the idea that solving murders is more important than protecting institutional reputation. The tragedy is that while this bureaucratic resistance continues, a killer remains free. Someone who murdered a 6-year-old child in her own home has lived nearly 3 decades without accountability, because the people charged with finding him are more concerned with protecting themselves than pursuing justice. Despite institutional resistance, momentum for finally solving the JonBenét Ramsey case is building in ways that would have been impossible even a few years ago. The combination of technological advancement, public pressure, and renewed media attention has created perfect conditions for a breakthrough that could come at any moment. The Netflix documentary's impact extended far beyond just raising awareness. Within weeks of its release, Boulder police reported a significant surge in new tips from viewers who had information they'd never shared before. These weren't just random speculation. These were specific leads from people who had been reluctant to come forward during the original investigation. Some tips came from people who were children in 1996 and are now adults willing to share what they witnessed. Others came from family members of deceased suspects who were finally ready to voice suspicions they'd harbored for decades. Still others came from individuals who had moved away from Boulder but remembered strange behaviors or suspicious activities around the time of the murder. John Ramsey himself has been following up on these leads, personally. In 2025, he received a letter from a woman claiming her husband could be responsible for JonBenét's death. Instead of simply forwarding this to police, John investigated the claim himself, demonstrating his hands-on approach to pursuing every possible lead. This represents a fundamental shift in how the case is being pursued. For years, the investigation was limited to official law enforcement channels that moved slowly and resisted outside input. Now multiple parallel investigations are running simultaneously. Boulder Police with their multidisciplinary team, Cindy Mara's work with Lou Smith's suspect list, John Ramsey's personal advocacy, and independent researchers motivated by the Netflix documentary. The FBI's continued involvement provides additional resources and expertise, even though Boulder PD retains primary investigative authority. Federal involvement means access to advanced forensic capabilities and national databases that local departments might not have. But perhaps most importantly, the case has achieved something that seemed impossible just a few years ago, a shift in media narrative, from conspiracy theories about family guilt to serious discussion of solving an unsolved murder. High-profile figures like Geraldo Rivera publicly apologizing to John Ramsey signals a broader acknowledgement that the family was unfairly maligned. This narrative shift matters because it creates space for honest discussion about what went wrong in the original investigation and what needs to happen now to finally solve the case. When media figures stop promoting conspiracy theories and start demanding accountability from law enforcement, that changes the political dynamics around the case. The technological landscape has also shifted dramatically in favor of solving cold cases. Genetic genealogy isn't experimental anymore. It's proven reliable and increasingly accessible. The cost has dropped significantly, the turnaround time has improved, and the success rate continues to climb. More importantly, public awareness of genetic genealogy's potential has reached a tipping point. Families of murder victims across America now know this technology exists and are demanding that it be used in their cases. The pressure that John Ramsey is applying in Boulder is being replicated by families in jurisdictions across the country. This creates a situation where law enforcement agencies that resist genetic genealogy look increasingly out of touch and obstructionist. Boulder police can claim they're pursuing all viable leads. But when families of murder victims in other states are getting results from genetic genealogy, those claims ring hollow. The surge in interest has also attracted new expertise to the case. Genetic genealogists who solved other high-profile cases have publicly expressed willingness to work on the JonBenét investigation. Independent forensic experts have offered their services. The technical capacity to solve this case has never been greater. What's building isn't just hope, it's inevitability. The combination of advanced technology, multiple parallel investigations, renewed public pressure, and John Ramsey's unwavering determination has created conditions where solving this case seems not just possible, but probable. The seventh life lesson here is about the power of persistence and timing. Sometimes justice requires waiting for the right combination of factors to align. John Ramsey couldn't have forced this breakthrough in 2010 or 2015 because the technology wasn't ready and public awareness wasn't sufficient. But in 2025, everything is coming together. The question isn't whether the JonBenét Ramsey case will be solved, it's when. Every month that passes brings new technological capabilities, new investigative techniques, and new pressure on those who have resisted change. John Ramsey told CNN he's optimistic after his meeting with Boulder's new police chief, and that optimism appears to be justified. Not because the police chief made specific promises, but because the entire environment around this case has changed in ways that make continued resistance increasingly difficult to maintain. When genetic genealogy finally identifies JonBenét's killer, and I believe it will, that moment will validate everything John Ramsey has fought for during nearly 3 decades of advocacy. It will prove that persistence in the face of institutional resistance can eventually overcome even the most entrenched bureaucratic obstacles. But it will also raise uncomfortable questions about how many other cases could be solved if law enforcement agencies embraced advanced technology instead of resisting it. How many other families could receive justice if institutional pride didn't block the path to truth? The surge of interest, tips, and investigative activity around the JonBenét Ramsey case represents something larger than just one family's quest for justice. It represents a fundamental shift in how society demands accountability from institutions that have failed to fulfill their basic responsibilities. After examining nearly 3 decades of the JonBenét Ramsey investigation, certain lessons emerge that extend far beyond this single case. These are lessons about justice, institutions, persistence, and the power of individual action in the face of systemic failure. Never stop fighting for truth. John Ramsey's 28-year campaign for justice demonstrates that giving up is never the answer, no matter how hopeless the situation appears. At 81 years old, he could easily retreat into privacy and accept that his daughter's case will never be solved. Instead, he's fighting harder than ever, using every available platform to demand accountability and action. His example shows that age, exhaustion, and repeated disappointment don't have to defeat determination. Sometimes the breakthrough comes not because you found new evidence or new technology, but because you simply refused to quit when everyone else gave up. Question authority when they resist transparency. The Boulder Police Department's resistance to genetic genealogy testing, despite its proven success in hundreds of other cases, should concern every citizen who relies on law enforcement for protection. When institutions claim they're doing everything possible, while simultaneously refusing to use the most advanced tools available, that's not professional judgment. That's institutional arrogance. Citizens have not just the right but the responsibility to demand that public servants use every available resource to fulfill their duties. Blind faith in authority is dangerous when that authority prioritizes self-protection over public service. Technology can overcome human bias. Modern forensic science, particularly genetic genealogy, represents humanity's best hope for overcoming the investigative mistakes, tunnel vision, and institutional failures that have plagued criminal justice for centuries. DNA doesn't lie. Genetic connections don't change based on theories or assumptions or departmental politics. When properly applied, advanced forensic technology can cut through decades of human error and bureaucratic resistance to reveal truth with mathematical precision. The challenge isn't technological. It's human willingness to accept what technology reveals, even when it contradicts long-held assumptions. Public pressure creates accountability. The Netflix documentary's impact on the JonBenét Ramsey case proves that sustained public attention can force institutions to confront their failures. Without media pressure and public scrutiny, Bolder police would likely continue their pattern of deflection and delay indefinitely. But when their handling of the case becomes a subject of national discussion, when their resistance to advanced technology becomes publicly embarrassing, when other families start asking why their cases aren't receiving the same attention, that creates pressure that's impossible to ignore. Democracy works when citizens demand accountability, not when they passively trust that institutions will police themselves. Justice delayed isn't justice denied. It's never too late. Perhaps the most important lesson from this case is that time doesn't eliminate the possibility of justice. Cases that seem hopeless can suddenly become solvable when new technology emerges, or new evidence surfaces, or new investigators take fresh approaches. The families who receive justice through genetic genealogy often waited 30, 40, or even 50 years for answers. Their persistence eventually paid off, not because they were lucky, but because they refused to accept that some murders are simply unsolvable. Technology advances, evidence gets re-examined, people come forward with information they've kept secret for decades. Justice can come at any moment, for those who never stop believing it's possible. These lessons matter because the JonBenét Ramsey case isn't unique. Across America, families are fighting for justice in cold cases, where law enforcement agencies resist using advanced technology. Bureaucratic inertia, institutional pride, and fear of embarrassment are blocking the path to truth in countless investigations. But change is coming. Genetic genealogy's success rate is creating pressure on agencies that refuse to use it. Families are becoming more sophisticated advocates for their cases. Media attention is increasingly focused on investigative failures rather than just crime narratives. The JonBenét Ramsey case has become a symbol of something larger than one family's quest for justice. It represents the principle that murder victims deserve investigation using every available tool, regardless of bureaucratic convenience. It represents the idea that institutional reputation matters less than solving crimes. It represents the belief that justice is always possible for those who refuse to give up. Subscribe if you believe every family deserves answers, and ring that notification bell so you'll know the moment this case finally breaks open. Because when it does break, and I believe it will, you'll want to be here for it. John Ramsey's fight for his daughter isn't just about JonBenét anymore. It's about establishing precedent for how society demands accountability from institutions that have failed to fulfill their most basic responsibilities. It's about proving that citizen advocacy can overcome bureaucratic resistance when that resistance stands between families and justice. Most importantly, it's about ensuring that no other family endures what the Ramseys have endured. Decades of suspicion, investigation failures, and institutional indifference while their loved one's killer remains free. The technology exists to solve this case. The evidence exists to identify the killer. The investigative foundation exists to build a prosecution. The only thing that has been missing is the will to pursue justice, regardless of who that might embarrass or what assumptions it might overturn. That will is building now, driven by a father who won't quit, technology that won't lie, and public pressure that won't accept excuses. The JonBenét Ramsey case will be solved, and when it is, it will prove that justice is always possible for those who never stop fighting for it. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Never giving up on justice, no matter how long it takes or how many obstacles stand in the way. JonBenét Ramsey deserves justice, her family deserves answers, and society deserves institutions that prioritize solving murders over protecting their own reputations. The breakthrough that changes everything isn't coming someday. It's coming now, driven by the unstoppable combination of advancing technology and unshakable determination. And when it arrives, it will prove that sometimes the longest fights yield the most important victories.